What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Welcome to part 2 of the Fundamental Theorem series. This video will be on the topic of value betting. So what can you expect coming up in this episode? Well, we're going to define value betting. We're going to talk about some of the common misconceptions regarding value betting. We'll have a demonstration of the expected value of value betting using an expected value calculator tool known as CardRunner's EV. We're going to talk about the impact of bet sizing on our expected value, and we're going to have a look at some worked hand history examples. Let's start at the beginning then with a definition of value betting. This is one of the core concepts or fundamental theorems of poker. You absolutely need to know what a value bet is. At the very basic level, a value bet is a bet designed to get called by worse hands. We think we have the best hand, we think our opponent's going to pair us off with worse. We put a bet out there hoping our opponent will call, and we end up winning the pot. However, there are some formulas associated with this which must be taken into account. It's not simply the case that we can expect to sometimes get called by worse hands, and that's a good enough reason to value bet. The key concept here is that we must have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. And that's just the basic version of the formula, because there are scenarios where we might have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range, but it still ends up being a non-profitable value bet. This would be in a scenario where perhaps our opponent raises aggressively. But we want to start at the beginning. So let's assume that we are on the river, let's assume that we are value betting, and let's assume that our opponent is never raising. And let's start by assuming that our opponent is always going to call. So it's going to be a highly simplified model, but it makes sense to start with a simple model when we are introducing ourselves to a concept. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you now to CardRunner's EV. As we mentioned at the outset, this is an expected value calculator. And we're going to use it to experiment with value betting and see what kind of results we get. The first thing we need to know is that we've modeled here for a river scenario. So we're ignoring any of the action on the earlier streets. However, we're going to assume that the board texture runs out Queen 9-5 rainbow, 2 of clubs on the turn, and 3 of hearts on the river. We're also going to assume that we are out of position and first to act in the big blind, whereas our opponent's on the button. We're going to assume that there are 100 chips already in the pot. And we're going to be betting half pot. And we're going to either assume that our opponent is not allowed to raise, or we're going to assume that we're all in. We're also going to assume that our opponent is not folding. Now that will of course influence the expected value if our opponent's going to be folding with some frequency. But we don't want to deal with things on a very subtle level just yet. We want to have a look at a very, very basic value bet model. We have ace-queen suited. That's the only hand we have in our range. So we specifically have that combo of ace-queen. And our opponent's going to be calling with some king-queen combos, and he's also going to be calling with pocket nines. So he has all combos of king-queen, which are going to be somewhat blocked by the board, and he's going to be calling with nines. In other words, our opponent's calling with a range that we're mostly good against, but occasionally he has us beat. So the first thing to understand about value betting is it's going to be the case that sometimes we make a correct value bet, our opponent's going to call, and he actually ends up having the best hand. That doesn't mean we made an incorrect value bet, because it depends on the frequency with which he shows up with a worse hand. Now, in terms of frequency, we can see CardRunner's EV has our equity listed here at 72.7%, which means our opponent's basically going to be good 27.3% of the time when he calls. That's the proportion of his range which is made up by the pocket nines. But we can see that we are an overwhelming favorite, and we're definitely going to have over 50% equity when called. So the next stage is now to analyze our expectation as a result of this river value bet. Now, CardRunner's EV lists the expected value of this decision, and we can see that the expected value of our decision is actually 95.45 big blinds, and the expected value of our button's call is actually 4.5 big blinds. Now, this might seem counterintuitive at first, because the button is making a losing call, so how is it that he has a positive expectation? Well, the answer is that he doesn't. He's not making money here. We have to remember, if we think about the grand scheme of things for this overall hand, there's 100 in the pot on the river. Now, where did that 100 come from? Well, roughly speaking, we probably invested about half of that, and our opponent invested about half of that. In other words, getting to the river, he's already down about 50 big blinds. So if he's scraping back 4.5 big blinds on the river, it basically means his expectation for the overall hand is overwhelmingly negative. In fact, he's actually losing about 45 big blinds for the overall hand. Now for us, our EV is 95. That doesn't mean we're making 95 big blinds for the overall hand, because it's taking into account that money that's in the middle on the river that no longer belongs to us. Once again, we invested probably 50 big blinds on earlier streets. So when we have an expectation of 95, it basically means that we're making about 45 big blinds with our value bet here on the river. Or more specifically, we're making 45 big blinds for the hand overall. Won't exactly be making 45 big blinds with a value bet on the river, because basically that includes our share of what's already in the middle. In other words, if we check down here on the river, we're going to generate an expectation above 50 big blinds. It's going to be positive for the overall hand. What we did by value betting was increasing our overall expectation. So to see what extra our value bet is netting us, what we could do now is we could change the action to check instead. And just to help us do this, it probably makes sense to just screenshot the results of our value bet, and we can kind of see how much extra we're being netted by a value bet when we compare the expectation to a check. So we're going to say there's 100 in the middle now, but rather than bet 50, we're actually going to check instead. So we're going to delete this particular node, and we're going to choose check instead, and our opponent's just going to check back with everything. We're going to click the EV run button here. We're going to have a look at our expectation. So you can see our EV now has dropped to 72.73. In other words, specifically that value bet on the river has netted us the difference between 72 and 95. It's going to be about 23 big blinds our value bet was worth there on the river. You can see we're going to make money overall if it gets checked down. We're going to make about 22 big blinds for the overall hand if it gets checked down, assuming we invested about 50 on earlier streets. Whereas when we value bet, we now make 45.45 for the entire hand. So we can see that our value bet is clearly profitable. I've returned now to the previous scenario because what we want to see is what happens if we don't meet that criteria of having at least 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. Now there's a pretty simple way of doing that. We're just going to edit our opponent's range now so that he has more combinations of hands that beat us. So let's remove the King Queen. In fact, let's just see what our equity is against that by running. So we can see if we just remove the King Queen offsuit combo, so now he's only calling with King Queen suited and pocket nines. And this is not meant to be realistic, it's just an example to see how the expectation is affected by not having over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. So we can see now that big blind, or us in this case, who are value betting our ace queen, we actually only have 40% equity when called in this case. So according to the definition of a value bet, this is going to be losing. Our opponent's going to be good 60% of the time when he calls. Now once again, we can see our expectation is positive here. We have an expectation of 30 big blinds with our river play. But we also realize that this is going to be losing. Assuming we invest about 50 big blinds, it means we're actually down about 20 big blinds for the overall hand. Once again, we're interested to see what that is when compared to the expectation of checking, because we're not necessarily losing 20 big blinds with our river value bet here. We know we're losing something. So let's screenshot this, and what we should expect to see is, now when we set the action to checking down, we should find that we're still losing money for the hand overall because we're not a favorite, so our opponent's going to profit. Our expectation should now be higher than 30 because we're not losing additional money with our river value bet. In other words, based on this very, very simple model, it's actually going to be higher EV for us to check rather than to make a losing value bet. So we've set the action to check now, and we can see our expectation has now gone up to 40. So we're still losing 10 big blinds for the overall hand based on the idea that our opponent gets to the river with a stronger range than us. But we can see that that river value bet, knowing that our opponent is going to be calling with a range which is mostly better hands, it's going to have a better hand 60% of the time, now our expectation drops an extra 10 big blinds. In other words, this is a losing value bet. So hopefully we should understand value betting on a basic level now. We can see how it increases our expectation when used correctly, but also how it actually lowers our expectation in a scenario where we don't have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the misconceptions, the parts of value betting that confuse players who only have a basic understanding. While this 50% equity rule is generally considered as the correct definition for value betting, it's actually not the only criteria. Getting raised can also kill us, and we can demonstrate this quite easily with Card Runners EV. So the first thing to understand from this example is that it's exactly the same as the initial value bet example. We're going to bet our ace queen, our opponent is going to call with the king queen and the pocket nines. That means we're actually going to be over a 70% favorite against his calling range. So we've actually met the criteria for a profitable value bet. But what we did in this case is we gave our opponent an arbitrary selection of extra hands, which you can see on the whole cards grid there. So just random junk, basically. It doesn't matter too much what the hand is. I mean, some of these are actually two pair, but let's just imagine that they're bluffs, or it doesn't really matter what he has. This is an extreme example where our opponent is actually only going to be calling 5.9% of the time, but is actually going to be raising 94.1% of the time, and we're going to assume we always fold to the raise. Now, if we have a look at our expectation, we can see it's super low. We actually are losing a ton of money in this scenario. In fact, it's going to be better for us to check fold in this case, because the expectation of check folding is going to be 0, whereas now because our opponent's raising aggressively, we're not even getting to realize any equity share in the pot. Now, of course, minus 41, we realize that doesn't mean we're losing 41 big blinds. It actually means we're losing 91 big blinds for the overall hand. So this is pretty much a train wreck. So despite being good after getting called, and it being a profitable scenario when we do get called, because it happens so infrequently and because our opponent's raising so much and we have to fold, then we can now see that we don't have a profitable value bet anymore. In fact, this is extremely losing for us because we often don't get to realize the equity and we end up folding against a raise from our opponent. Once again, it's not meant to be a realistic example. It's just important here that you understand that having 50% equity against your opponent's calling range is not the only criteria. To cite a pre-flop example of this, sometimes players think that when they maybe 4-bet and their opponent 5-bets a lot of better hands, and they end up being a favorite against the range their opponent calls a 4-bet with, they then think this is justification for making a 4-bet. They say, okay, well, although I'm behind his continuing range, I'm okay against his calling range. Well, we can see from this example that that's not the case. You have to really be ahead of your opponent's continuing range. You can't just purely be ahead of their calling range, because if they raise hyper-aggressively and you don't get to realize your equity, then it ends up being hugely minus EV. The next misconception, and this is one that I see super commonly, it's a mistake that even advanced players make. Let's say, for example, we are on the flop, and we have something like a weak top pair. And we bet the flop for value, and let's say we do indeed have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. This is not necessarily a value bet, because what we have to keep in mind is that we still have 2 streets left to play, especially problematic when we're out of position. So think of it this way: if you have over 51% equity against your opponent's calling range on the flop, but you're in a scenario where you're going to be forced to fold the turn and river at an extremely high frequency, is that flop bet still profitable? And the answer is no. So one important lesson to keep in mind here is that value betting theory applies most accurately to the river. You can't just plug in a bunch of numbers on the flop and say, okay, I have 52% equity against his calling range, I must value bet here. It doesn't work like that, especially out of position. Because if you value bet something like a weak top pair on the flop and your opponent's going to bluff you off your holding, especially on dangerous turn and river runouts, then you're not accurately value betting the flop anymore. You're actually just putting extra money into the pot which your opponent's going to win on a later street. So in some cases, just because you have over 50% equity against your opponent's calling range doesn't always mean that it's going to be correct to fire a bet for value, because you may lose control of that pot on a later street. So most of this value bet theory applies most accurately to the river. Once we're considering flop and turn, we have to now seriously consider any playability issues which may prevent us from reaching showdown. The final thing to keep in mind as well is that a profitable value bet does not guarantee max EV. Just because you have 55% equity against your opponent's calling range when you value bet does not automatically mean that value betting is the best play. We're not just trying to make profitable decisions right now, we're trying to generate the most money possible. And once again, we can use Card Runner's EV to construct a rather contrived example. And just so you can follow this, I'm going to try and make it as clear as possible regarding what I'm doing. So for this example, I'm going to show you the working. Now let's just modify our opponent's range. So he still has this king, queen, and nines that we've been using as kind of the core part of his calling range. And we're going to give him a selection of bluffs as well. And we just need to make sure that some of these bluffs are not actually strong value hands. So for example, you can see that any 2x or 3x actually has a pair. So we're going to give him a slightly different range of bluffs right now. So we can see there's stuff like 6-7 and 7-8 that's busted. So let's say he has these holdings as well. Don't need to worry too much about whether this is realistic. The point is, he has some hands he's calling with on the river, and he also has some hands which are busted draws. And what we're going to do is, we're going to assume that he folds those hands against a bet. So he's going to be calling with his top pair in a set of nines, and he's going to be folding the rest. So I just press the F7 button, or the run button as it's known. Just make sure everything's correct here. So we're betting 50. He's calling. Now notice now that he's only calling 25.6% of the time, because 75% of the time he actually has one of these busted draws which he's going to be folding. So he's only going to be calling with his king, queen, and his nines. So hopefully that makes sense what we're seeing right now. So the expectation is very good in this case. The overall EV for the hand is 98.84. So same as before, we're going to snapshot that. See the expectation there, and we're going to modify the example slightly now so that we actually decide to check instead of bet. And our opponent's basically going to bet his entire range, and we're going to call. So we're going to delete this. We're going to check now. Our opponent's going to bet. So he's going to bet the same sizing that we were going to bet. So we're going to put half pot there. And we're obviously not going to fold. We're just going to call everything, basically. So the difference here is that if we have a value hand, we're still getting an extra 50 in the middle. However, if our opponent is now bluffing, rather than him just folding and us not gaining extra money, we're actually going to make 50 big blinds every time he bluffs. So we should find that our expectation for the overall scenario is going to be higher. Let's do an EV run in this case. And you can see that our expectation is now 136.05. So we have an overall expectation probably of around 86 big blinds for the overall hand, as opposed to our original 48 big blinds. Because remember that 50 big blinds is what we invested previously, so we can't count that as our overall expectation for the hand. So we can see that it's a scenario where we could profitably value bet. In fact, it was very profitable. And you can see that the expectation does benefit from the fact that our opponent is folding. So if we put in a scenario where he just calls with that range, our EV wasn't quite as high as 98. It was high, but it wasn't 98 high. So now we get some extra expectation from the fact that our opponent is going to be folding with some frequency. So it's a very, very profitable value bet here in this case, but that doesn't guarantee that it's the max EV play. Because in this particular case, our opponent has a tendency to bluff hyper-aggressively. Now it's important to keep in mind that this is not necessarily realistic in the sense that most low-limit games, your opponent will not play like this if you check. He won't necessarily bet hyper-aggressively. In fact, he may just bet with his premiums and check the rest. So check calling can often end up being a very, very bad idea. In fact, one of the worst lines you can take in low-limit poker is to play bet, and then check call river, because of this tendency that our opponents have to not stab very aggressively when we skip our river bet. So this might not be the best line in practice, but given the model we've constructed here, we can see that checking the river is actually much higher EV than betting. There's a significant difference here. So just because we have a profitable value bet does not automatically mean that it's going to be the best play. And in many scenarios, the thinner our value bet gets, the more likely there is to be another option. So a profitable value bet does not guarantee max EV, it just guarantees we're making money, but what we're interested in is maximizing our EV as much as possible. Now we've seen an introduction now to Card Runner's EV, so it's a useful tool for calculating expectation. We've seen some examples of how our expectation for value betting can be affected by some of the variables that we've input. It's a good tool to get used to. It's even a good tool for you to purchase, and I don't have any vested interest in telling you to get this. I'm not signed up with some kind of deal with Card Runner's EV. It's just very, very good calculation software. In recent times also, Card Runner's EV has implemented an equilibrium solver. What that basically means is Card Runner's EV can do some of the same stuff that you hear players talking about regarding PioSolver and also other softwares which are used but are less popular, for example GTO Range Builder, Simple Post Flop. Card Runner's EV can do the same stuff at a much lower price tag. So it's good software to get used to using. And it's also one that doesn't appear in that many training videos, so we're going to be using this throughout the various videos in this package and also some of the other packages to really help you to develop a much stronger relationship with the line you take and the expectation you generate. Because at the end of the day, rather than understanding linguistic terms such as value betting and bluffing, the most important thing is understanding what our expectation is when we take these lines. So we're going to try and develop a closer relationship with the line we take and our expectation. Now we're going to move on to value bet sizing. I'm going to start once again at a very, very simple basic level. Which of the following generates the highest expectation? $50 bet, which gets called 40% of the time, $100 bet, which gets called 15% of the time, $30 bet, which gets called 80% of the time. And once again, we're going to have our basic default assumptions, which is our opponent is not going to be raising. He's either going to be calling or he's going to be folding. So you could think of these as all-in bets if it makes it easier. The point is our opponent is either calling or folding. And depending on the size of the bet we make, we get called with a differing frequency. So which of these bets is the most profitable? If you could choose one of these, which one would you choose? And by the way, also, if this wasn't clear, we're also going to assume that we're always good when we get called. So we're going to assume we basically have the nuts. And what that means is if we make a $50 bet and get called 40% of the time, then our expectation is actually 40% of $50. Very, very straightforward. So the first bet there has an expectation of $20. Hopefully it's not a huge leap in terms of mathematics to then figure out that the second bet, 15% of 100, actually has an expectation of 15. So despite the fact that we sometimes get a larger bet paid off, the expectation is going to be inferior. We're definitely not going to pick that second bet. So it's now just a competition between the first bet and whatever the expectation of that final bet is. So a $30 bet. Actually the smallest of the three bets, but our opponent doesn't like folding to small bets. Apparently, he actually calls 80% of the time. Our expectation is actually now $24. So you can see each of these bet sizings has similar expectation, but one of them has a higher expectation than the other two. And it's not necessarily the largest bet. Sometimes people think that the goal of value betting is to get the biggest bet paid off possible. Well, we can see here that that's not the case, because although we can sometimes get a $100 bet paid off, because it only succeeds with a 15% frequency, it's not going to be the most profitable thing to do in the long run. In fact, in this case, it's actually better for us to bet $30. Now, we don't want for you to think the opposite either. It's not the case that smaller value bets are necessarily better. It's just to do with the frequency in this case, because if a $100 bet got paid off 30% of the time, that would actually now be the best bet sizing out of the three. So we've once again gone back to our original value bet example. We can recap that our expectation was 95.45. We're going to just play around with our bet sizing now, and we're going to assume that our opponent's calling range doesn't change. And of course, it will change in most cases. In the scenario where it doesn't change, we describe this as an inelastic calling range, and there are scenarios where this will happen, especially against calling stations who don't want to fold anything ever. And naturally, against a calling station, the larger we bet, generally the better, because it won't necessarily influence his calling frequency too much, but we'll be putting more money in the middle when we have an equity edge. But in other situations, you're going to have to make some estimates. You're going to have to think deeply about what part of your opponent's range you're targeting and how can you elicit the most calls. For example, if it's a spot where you think your opponent's range is quite weak and it's quite capped, then betting a large sizing for value might not make the most sense exploitatively, because you're going to elicit a high amount of folds. If you think your opponent often has maybe a lot of second pair hands, for example, or weak pairs below top pair, then probably you'll find that a smaller bet makes more sense. Okay, you're not going to make as much when you get called, but because you're going to be getting called at a much higher frequency, you generate a higher long-run expectation. So we've screenshot this particular example. Now let's change the bet sizing. Let's say that we instead bet a larger sizing. Let's say we bet pot, and then let's delete the old node, and let's say that our opponent calls every time. And let's run the EV calculation. You can see that our expectation now jumps up to 118, and originally it was 95.45. So let's see what happens if we bet even larger. Let's say that we decide to shove all in, and I set the effective stacks for 300. That is the one slight difference in this case. So we're going to shove all in. I'm just going to delete the other nodes, which we don't want. So we bet all in, button decides to call, and let's have a look at our expectation. You can see it jumps up to 209.09. But now let's imagine we do that, and in an extreme example, our opponent just now decides to fold every time as a result. And we run the expectation of a fold. You can see that our expectation is 100. And you know, that's a pretty good expectation. It means we're making 50 big blinds for the overall hand. And if we compare it to the scenario where we value bet for 50, we can see our overall EV is 95.45. It's actually better for us to shove for 300 big blinds compared to value bet for 50 big blinds, given the parameters we've defined here. Now that doesn't mean that we should turn ace-queen into a bluff, as we pretty much are in the case of us betting 300 big blinds, because our opponent's even folding pocket nines, which you can argue about whether that's realistic. But we're basically bluffing with ace-queen, and usually it's going to be much better for us to find a point where we can value bet and our opponent's still going to be calling with a reasonable frequency. It can in some cases be very profitable if the opponent folds his entire range. In some cases we should turn a made hand into a bluff even if we can profitably value bet, because the expectation of a bluff will simply be higher. But in this case, despite betting 300 having a higher expectation than 50, well, we saw that we could probably value bet for 100, or even anywhere between 50 and 300, where we value bet, we get called with some frequency, and we should expect our expectation to be higher in that case. So although turning the hand into a bluff is profitable, once again, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be the max EV thing to do, and we should be able to find a value bet in this situation. The only thing we need to figure out as poker players is which value bet's going to have the highest long-run expectation. And that's going to be a function of the sizing we use, but also how frequently that sizing gets paid off. So we can see betting 300 is profitable, but it never gets paid off. So it's probably not going to be the most profitable thing to do. We're basically just folding our opponent off his entire range. We want to maybe bet for maybe 100. Our opponent's going to call with a higher frequency. We should generate a higher long-run expectation that way. Okay, now it's time for some worked hand histories examples, and these won't be super complicated or anything. So in this hand we ISO raise ace-king in a small blind against a button limp. Notice he doesn't have a full stack. What that should tell us in general is that we can be value betting bigger than average, assuming we've got something like top pair, top kicker. Maybe we normally bet 70% pot, but against this guy we can probably be betting pot size. So keep in mind the type of opponent you're facing. That's going to have an impact on what is going to be the correct value bet sizing. So we just turn so much equity in this case, we decide to bluff, and also our turn sizing is not a coincidence. We're deliberately setting up roughly a pot size bet for the river. We spike our nut draw and we're just going to shove, and we have the nuts here, so basically anything that our opponent calls us with is going to be worse in our hand, with the exception of there are some, or one straight flush combo, which is going to be the 10-9 of clubs, but we're going to assume he doesn't have that. We have the effective nuts here, and what that means is we don't need to worry about our opponent beating us over 50% of the time when he calls in this scenario. It's really just a case of, will he pay off, for example, a half pot bet with a much higher frequency than he'll pay off a pot size bet. And in this example, the answer is probably going to be no. This guy's a weaker player. He's probably going to pay off a pot size bet with a comparable frequency to how often he'd pay off a half pot size bet. And what that means is the pot size bet's just going to have a higher expectation in this case. So this is a really simple example of a value bet. Opponent calls in this case, and I think he has the second nut flush, excluding the possible straight flush combos, of course. Now let's look at a slightly different example where we don't have the nuts, and as a result we need to be a little bit more careful with our sizing. So in this hand we open pocket tens from the small blind, flop an overpair, we continuation bet the flop, continuation bet the turn. Should be pretty straightforward so far. Now we did say, for example, that we can't necessarily just use the raw equity definition here. I mean, we do have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range, but of course there are some bad runouts with tens where we'll be forced to fold on the turn and river. Having said that, tens has got so much of an equity edge against our opponent's calling range that it should be fine. We should be able to navigate the later streets. But let's say, for example, a hand like pocket sevens here. You can probably actually value bet the flop with pocket sevens. But what's the problem with that value bet? You can run into difficulty on later streets. Now, we're not saying you shouldn't bet sevens, but we're just saying that defining sevens as a value bet on this flop texture is dicey use of terminology. Because at the end of the day, just because we have over 50% equity against our opponent's flop calling range does not really mean the hand is being value bet effectively, because a whole bunch of bad turn and river cards are going to come, and we're going to be forced to fold our sevens with a high frequency on later streets. So usage of the word value bet can be called into question. Whereas with tens, we have so much equity against our opponent's calling range that we might even be able to bet 3 streets in some cases if we're careful with our sizing, so it's probably okay to refer to this as a value bet. But as we mentioned earlier in the video, we should understand that value bet theory applies most accurately to the river. So we're referring to this as a value bet, but we're somewhat loose in the way we're using the term. Same really applies on the turn. If you're in a scenario where you have over 50% equity against your opponent's turn calling range, but you have to fold every river, it's not really a value bet on the turn. So in this situation, we reach the river and we don't have really clear value. It's not as if we can just shovel in and we can expect to be great against our opponent's calling range. By this stage, there's a possibility that he might have some kind of 2-pair combo. Maybe he rivered a straight. These things are possible. We can't just shove all in, for example, for a massive overbet. That means we're not going to have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range still. We'll probably generate a ton of folds, so it might end up not being that bad in terms of expectation, as we've seen, but it's not going to generate the highest expectation, and that's what we're interested in. So the goal here is to understand that we're targeting stuff like 9x hands, maybe pocket 8s, 7x, and he's not going to feel super comfortable about facing a large 3-barrel if he has something like Jack 9. So we have to keep our sizing on the smaller side here. The idea is that although we're betting smaller, because the price is going to be more attractive for him if he has something like a 9x, we're going to get paid off with a higher frequency. So a smaller sizing should generate a long-run higher expectation in this case. So we still bet reasonably large because in-game I think we assumed this guy was a recreational player. But just keep in mind, relative to the situation, this is actually quite a large bet. We don't want to make it any bigger than this, definitely. In this case, he does pay us off with a 9x, which is great. That's what we want. Whereas if we bet pot size in the river, maybe he folds a 9x, which is still going to be plus EV for us, but it's not going to be max EV. It's going to be a little bit like shoving that ace-queen for 300 big blinds when we fold out things like pocket 9s. We made money, it was quite profitable for us, but relative to what we could be making in terms of the higher EV line, it wasn't a good decision. So it's the same kind of thing here with 10s. Probably could shovel in with 10s profitably, but now we're maybe even folding out stuff like 2-pair if the guy's scared, for example. It's not going to be the highest expectation thing to do. We want a value bet for a smallish sizing, and this is how we maximize our long-run expectation. Okay, so that roughly brings us to the end of the first part of the series on value betting. So this is what you should be able to do by the end of this video. Firstly, understand what a value bet is, how you can define it. Understand some of the misconceptions players have regarding value bets. How it's not just the case that we only need 50% equity against our opponent's calling range in order for it to be a profitable value bet. If he raises aggressively, it can end up being a losing value bet. We also want to understand the relevance of value betting on earlier streets. If we have a weak made hand which we're value betting on the flop, it might not be correct to refer to that as a value bet because we're going to end up giving up on the turn and river so frequently. It might be more accurate to describe it as a protection bet. But the exact terminology is not important, as we're going to go on to explain in later videos in this series. The most relevant thing is whether our bet generates the highest expectation, not whether we refer to it as a protection bet or a bluff or a semi-bluff or a value bet. Terminology can sometimes be more of a hindrance than a help in this game. We should also understand the impact of bet sizing on our value bets. So we saw how increasing the sizing can generate a higher expectation, but so long as our opponent's calling frequency remains static, and so long as we don't make our opponent call with a range which now has us beat because it's a lot stronger than our betting range. So in some cases we may maximize our expectation with a large sizing, but in other cases, if our opponent has a weak range, for example, or if we have a weakish hand that we're value betting ourselves, we're probably going to maximize our expectation with a smaller bet that's going to have more equity against the opponent's calling range and is going to get paid off with a higher frequency. Alright, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. Look forward to catching you in the second part of this series on fundamental theorems. This has been Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.